Insularity of the land masses. The division of the Earth's surface into 28% land and 72% water is an all-important fact of physical geography and anthropo-geography. Owing to this proportion, the land masses, which alone provide habitats for man, rise as islands out of the threefold larger surface of the uninhabitable ocean. Consequently, the human species, like the other forms of terrestrial life, bears a deeply ingrained insular character. Moreover, the water causes different degrees of separation between the landmasses, according as it appears as inlet, strait, sea, an island-strewn or islandless ocean. It determines the grouping of the habitable areas and consequently the geographic basis of the various degrees of ethnic and cultural kinship between the divisions of land. Finally, since the sea is for man only a highway to some ulterior shore, this geography of the landmasses in relation to the encompassing waters points the routes and goals of human wanderings. Each fragment of habitable land, large or small, continent or islet, means a corresponding group or detachment of the vast human family. Its size fixes the area at the service of the group which occupies it. Its location, however, may either endow it with a neighborliness like that subsisting between Africa and Europe and involving an interwoven history, or remoteness like that of South America from Australia, so complete that even the close net of intercourse thrown by modern commerce over the whole world has scarcely sufficed to bring them into touch. Therefore, the highly irregular distribution of the land areas, here compactly grouped, though remote, deserves a special attention, since it produces far-reaching results. Finally, continents and islands, by their zonal situation, their landforms, rainfall, river systems, flora and fauna, produce for man varied life conditions, which in their turn are partially dependent upon the size and grouping of the landmasses. Classification of landmasses according to size and location. A comparison of the large and small landmasses from the standpoint of both physical and anthropological geography yields a classification based upon size and location on the one hand, and historical influences on the other. The following table indicates the relation between the two. I. Independent landmasses. A. Continents. Independent by reason of size, which enables them to support a large number of people and afford the conditions for civilization. A. Insular continents, whose primitive and modern development are marked by remoteness. Australia. B. Neighboring continents, separated by narrow seas and showing community of historical events. Europe and Africa. Asia and North America around Bering Sea. B. Islands. Independent by reason of location. A. Oceanic islands, characterized by greatest remoteness from continents and other islands, and also by independent or detached history. St. Helena and Iceland. B. Member of a group of oceanic islands, therefore less independent. Hawaii, Fayal and the Azores, Tonga Tabu. C. Large islands, approaching by reason of size the independence of continents and thereby finding compensation for a less independent location. New Guinea, Borneo, Madagascar, in a cultural sense, Great Britain and Japan. 2. Dependent landmasses. F. Inshore or coast islands, whose history is intimately connected with that of the nearby mainland. Euboea, Long Island, Vancouver, Sakhalin, Ceylon. B. Neighboring islands, showing less intimate historical relations. Formosa, the Canaries, Ireland in contrast to Great Britain. C. Islands of enclosed or marginal seas, contained in a circle of lands and exposed to constant intercourse from all sides. Jamaica, Java, Crete, Sicily, Zealand, Gotland, St. Lawrence and Bering Sea. D. Island groups not to be considered apart from other groups. Samoa, Fiji and Friendly Isles, Philippine, Sulu and Sunda Islands, Greater and Lesser Antilles. Effective size of landmasses. As the homes of man, these landmasses vary greatly owing to difference of size. Only the 6 continents have been large enough to generate great bodies of people, to produce differentiated branches of the human family, and to maintain them in such numerical force that alien intermixtures were powerless essentially to modify the gradually developing ethnic type. The larger continents are marked by such diversity of climate, relief, and contour, that they have afforded the varied environments and the area for the development of several great types or subtypes of mankind. Australia has been just large enough to produce one distinct native race, the result of a very ancient blend of Papuan and Malayan stocks. But prevailing aridity has cast a mantle of monotony over most of the continent, nullifying many local geographic differences in highland and lowland, curtailing the available area of its already restricted surface, and hence checking the differentiation that results either from the competition of large numbers or from a varied environment. We find Australia characterized above all other continents by monotony of culture, mode of life, customs, languages, and a uniform race type from the Murray River to York Peninsula. 747 The twin continents of the Americas developed a race singularly uniform in its physical traits, 748 if we leave out of account the markedly divergent Eskimos, but displaying a wide range of political, social, and economic developments, from the small, unorganized groups of wandering savages, like the desert Shoshones and coast Fuegians, to the large, stable empire of the Incas, with intensive agriculture, public works, a state religion, and an enlightened government. Even the largest islands of the world, such as Borneo, New Guinea, and Madagascar, show no such independent ethnic development. This is the distinguishing characteristic of the largest landmasses. Europe, except on the basis of its size and peninsula form, has no title to the name of continent, certainly not on anthropo-geographical grounds. Its classification as a continent arose in the Mediterranean among the Greeks, as a geographical expression of the antagonism between themselves and their Carian, Phoenician, and Persian enemies across the Aegean. The idea had therefore a political origin, and was formed without knowledge of that vast stretch of plains between the Black Sea and the Arctic Ocean, where Asia's climate and races lap over into Europe, and where today we find the Muscovite Empire, in point of geographic conditions. Its underlying ethnic stock and form of government, as much Asiatic as European. The real or Western Europe, which the Roman Empire gradually added to the narrow Europe of the Greeks, and which is strikingly contrasted to Asia in point of size, relief, contour, climate, and races, only served to maintain the distinction between the two continents in men's minds. But from a geographical standpoint, the distinction is an error. It has confused the interpretation of the history of the Greeks and the development of the Russians. It has brought disorder into the question of the European or Asiatic origin of the Aryan linguistic family, which the anthropo-geographer would assign to the single continent of Eurasia. The independent development that falls to the lot of great world islands like the Americas and Australia is impossible in a peninsular continent like Europe, large as it is. Independence of location versus independence of size. The independence of a landmass is based not alone on size, there is also an independence of location. This, owing to the spherical form of the Earth, tends to be neutralized by the independence based upon large area. The larger a landmass is, the nearer it approaches to others. Eurasia, the largest of all the continents, comes into close proximity and therefore close relations with Africa, North America, and even Australia, whereas Australia is at once the smallest and the most isolated of the continents. The remote oceanic islands of the Atlantic Ocean, measuring only a few square miles in area, have a location so independent of other inhabited lands, that before the period of the great discoveries they had never appeared on the horizon of man. The case of Asia. Asia's size and central location to the other continents were formerly taken as an argument for its correspondingly significant position in the creation and history of man. Its central location is reflected in the hypothesis of the Asiatic origin of the Indo-European linguistic group of peoples, and though the theory has been justly called into question, these peoples have undoubtedly been subjected to Asiatic influences. The same thing is true of the Native American race, both as to Asiatic origin and influences, because the approximation of Siberia to Alaska is too close to exclude human relations between the two continents. The Malays, too, were probably sprung from the soil of southeastern Asia and spread thence over their close-packed archipelago. Even the native Australians betray a Malayan and therefore Asiatic element in their composition, 749, while the same element can be traced yet more distinctly in the widely scattered Polynesians and the Hovas of Madagascar. This radiation of races seems to reflect Asia's location at the core of the landmasses. Yet the capacity to form such centers of ethnic distribution is not necessarily limited to the largest continents. History teaches us that small areas which have early achieved a relatively dense population are prone to scatter far their seeds of nations. Location of hemispheres and ethnic kinship. The continents harbor the most widely different races where they are farthest apart, where they converge most nearly. They show the closest ethnic kinships. The same principle becomes apparent in their plants and animals. The distribution of the landmasses over the Earth is conspicuous for their convergence in the north and divergence in long peninsular forms toward the south. The contrasted grouping is reflected in both the lower animals and the peoples inhabiting these respectively vicinal and remote lands. Only where North America and Eurasia stretch out arms to one another around the polar sea do eastern and western hemispheres show a community of mammalian forms. These are all strictly Arctic animals, such as the reindeer, elk, Arctic fox, glutton and ermine. 750. This is the boreal subregion of the Holoarctic zoological realm, characterized by a very homogeneous and very limited fauna. 751. In contrast, the portion of the hemispheres lying south of the Tropic of Cancer is divided into 4 distinct zoological realms, corresponding to Central and South America, Africa south of Sahara, the 2 Indian peninsulas with the adjacent islands, and Australia. 752. But when we consider the continental extremities projecting beyond the Tropic of Capricorn, where geographic divergence reaches a climax, we find their faunus and floras utterly dissimilar, despite the fact that climate and physical conditions are very similar. 753. We find also widely divergent races in the southern sections of Africa, Australia or Tasmania and South America, while Arctic Eurasia and America come as near meeting ethnically as they do geographically. Here and here only both eastern and western hemispheres show a strong affinity of race. The Eskimo, long classed as Mongoloid, are now regarded as an aberrant variety of the American race, owing to their narrow head form and linguistic affinity. Though in Alaska even their head form closely approximates the Mongoloid Siberian type. 754. But in stature, color, oblique eyes, broad flat face, and high cheekbones, in his temperament and character, artistic productions, and some aspects of his culture, he groups with the Asiatic Hyperboreans across the narrow 60 miles of water forming Bering Strait. 755. In the northern part of the Earth's land area, the distribution of floras, faunus, and races shows interdependence, intercourse, in the southern, separation, isolation. Continental convergence and ethnic kinship. What is true where the hemispheres come together is true also where continents converge. The core of the Old World is found in the Mediterranean basin, where Europe, Asia and Africa form a close circle of lands and where they are inhabited by the one white Mediterranean race. Contrast their racial unity about this common center with the extremes of ethnic divergence in their remote peripheries, where Teutons, Mongols, Malays and Negroes differ widely from the Mediterranean stock and from each other. Eastern Australia represents the ethnic antipodes of Western Asia, in harmony with the great dividing distance between them, but the sides of these continents facing each other across the bridge of the Sunda Islands are sparsely strewn with a common Malay element. Africa's location. Africa's early development was never helped by the fact that the continent lay between Asia and South America. It was subjected to strong and persistent Asiatic influences, but apparently to no Native American ones. From that far-off transatlantic shore came no signs of life. Africa appears in history as an appendage of Asia, a cultural peninsula of the larger continent. This was due not only to the Suez Isthmus and the narrowness of the Red Sea Rift, but to its one-sided invasion by Asiatic races and trade from the east, while the western side of the continent lay buried in sleep, unstirred by any voice from the silent shores of America. Semitic influences, in successive waves, spread over the Dark Continent as far as Morocco, the Senegal, Niger, Lake Chad, Nyanza, Tanganyika and Nyassa, and gave it such light as it had before the 16th century. Only after the Atlantic Gulf was finally crossed did influences from the American side of the ocean begin to impinge upon the West African coast, first in the form of the slave and rum trade, then in the more humane aspect of the Liberian colony. But with the full development of the Atlantic period in history, we see all kinds of Atlantic influences, though chiefly from the Atlantic states of Europe, penetrating eastward into the heart of Africa, and there meeting other commercial and political activities pressing inland from the Indian Ocean. The Atlantic Abyss. The long Atlantic rift between the eastern and western hemispheres, which was such a potent factor in the primitive retardation of Africa, is, from the standpoint of Anthropo-Geography, the most important feature in the distribution of the landmasses over the globe. Not till the discovery of America bridged this abyss did the known world become a girdle round the earth. Except the Norse ventures to the American continent by way of Iceland and Greenland between 1000 and 1347, no account of pre-Columbian intercourse between the two shores of the Atlantic has ever been substantiated. Columbus found the opposite land unfamiliar in race as in culture. He described the people as neither whites nor blacks, the two ethnic types which he knew on the eastern side of the Atlantic abyss. He and his successors found in the Americas only a Stone Age culture, a stage already outgrown by Europe and Africa. These continents from Lapland to the Hottentot country were using iron. Prior to the voyage of the great Genoese, Europe gave nothing to America and received nothing from it, except the Gulf Stream's scanty cargo of driftwood stranded on bleak Icelandic shores. The tertiary land bridge across the North Atlantic between Norway and Greenland may possibly have guided a pre-Caucasic migration to America and given that continent part of its aboriginal population. 756. However, no trace of any European stock remains. Atlantic islands uninhabited. The collapse of the bridge at the close of the glacial epoch left the Atlantic abyss effectually dividing the two hemispheres. Its islands, few and far between, were helpless to maintain intercourse between the opposite shores. This is proven by the fact that all of them from Greenland to Tristan da Cunha, excepting only the Canaries, were uninhabited at the time of their discovery. History records when the first bold voyagers came upon them in that unmarked waste of waters, and gave them their first occupants. The political upheavals of Norway in King Harfagur's time, 872, sent to the Faroes and Iceland their first settlers, though these islands were previously known to the Celts of Ireland. The Norse colonists who went to Greenland in the year 1000 seem to have been the first regular settlers on those inhospitable coasts. They found no native inhabitants, but numerous abandoned dwellings, fragments of boats and stone implements. 757, which doubtless recorded the intermittent voyages thither of the Eskimo, preliminary to permanent occupation. The Scandinavians did not encounter natives on the island till the 12th century, when Greenland probably received its first Eskimo immigration. 758. Geographical character of the Pacific. While the Atlantic thus formed a long north and south rift across the inhabited world at the period of the great discoveries, the Pacific, strewn with islands and land-rimmed at its northern extremity by the peninsulas of Alaska and eastern Siberia, spread a nebula of population from the dense centers of Asia across to the outskirts of America. The general Mongoloid character of the American Indians as a race, the stronger Asiatic stamp of the Western Eskimo, the unmistakable ethnic and cultural affinities of the Northwest Coast tribes both with Southern Polynesians and Asiatics, 759, all point to America as the great eastern wing of the Mongoloid or Asiatic area, and therefore as the true Orient of the world. Geographic conditions have made this possible or even probable. The winds and currents of the North Pacific set from Japan straight toward the American coast. Junks blown out to sea from China or Japan have been carried by the Kuro-Saiwo and the prevailing westerlies across the Pacific to our continent. There is record of 100 instances of this occurrence. 760. Pacific affinities of North American Indians. The broken bridge across Bering Strait formed by East Cape, Cape Prince of Wales and the Diomede Islands between, and further south the natural causeway of the Commander and Aleutian Islands leading from the peninsula of Kamchatka to that of Unalaska, have facilitated intercourse between Asia and America. 761 Justin Windsor says, "There is hardly a stronger demonstration of such connection between the two continents than the physical resemblances of the peoples now living on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean in these upper latitudes." 762 This resemblance is by no means confined to the Eskimo and Chukches, who have exchanged colonists across Bering Sea. Recent investigations have revealed a wider kinship. The population of northern Siberia speaks in general Ural-Altaic languages, but it includes a few scattered tribes whose singular speech excludes them from this linguistic group, and who have therefore been placed by ethnologists in a distinct class called Paleasiatics or Hyperboreans. This class is composed of the Ostiak and Khat on the Yenisei River, the Gilyak and Ainos at the mouth of the Amur and on the Kuril, Sakhalin and Yezo Islands, the Kamchatal and Koryak of Kamchatka, and the Chukches and Yukagir of extreme northeastern Siberia. As far back as 1850, the eminent philologist Robert Latham noted a marked linguistic agreement, both in structure and verbal affinity, between our northwest coast tribes and the peoples of the islands and peninsulas fringing northeastern Asia. Koryak is notably American, he said. 763 The recent Jessup expedition to the northwest coast of America and the nearby coast of Asia investigated the Koryak, to determine whether in the past there had been any connection between the cultures and ethnic types of the Old and New World. These investigations have proved beyond doubt a kinship of culture, attributable either to a remote common origin or to former contact, long and close, between these isolated Siberian tribes and the American Aborigines. They show that the Koryak are one of the Asiatic tribes standing nearest to the northwestern American Indian. 764, see map page 103. Polynesian affinities. W. H. Dahl finds the inhabitants of the Pacific slope of North America conspicuously allied with Oceanica in cultural achievements, whose origin he therefore assigns to that vast congeries of islands stretching from Asia toward South America in latitude 25 degrees south. These islands, closely clustered as far as the Paumota group, straggle along with widening spaces between, through Easterl, which carries the indestructible memorials of a strange civilization, through Salawai Gomez, San Felix, and St. Ambrose almost to the threshold of the Peruvian coast. It is to be noted that these islands lie just outside the westward-bearing equatorial current and trade winds, on the margin of the South Pacific anticyclonic winds and a southern current which sets towards the Peruvian coast. 765 A more probable avenue for the introduction of these Polynesian or Malayan elements of culture is found in O. T. Mason's theory, that primitive mariners of the southwestern Pacific, led into migration by the eternal food quest, may have skirted the seaboard of East Asia and Northwest America, passing along a great circle route through the succession of marginal seas and archipelagos to various ports of entry on the Pacific front of America. Such a route, favored by the prevailing marine currents and winds from the southwest, and used repeatedly during long periods of time, might have introduced trans-Pacific elements of race and culture into the western side of America. 766. The real Orient of the world. Moreover, primitive America resembled Oceanica and Northern Asia in its ignorance of iron, in its Stone Age civilization, and its retarded social and political development. Such affinities as it shows were predominantly Pacific or Trans-Pacific. 767 On its Atlantic side, it stood out in striking contrast to the contemporaneous civilizations and races in Europe and Africa. This was its unneighbored shore, lying on the eastern margin of that broad zone of habitation which stretched hence westward on and on around the world, to the outermost capes of Europe and Africa. The Atlantic abyss formed the single gap in this encircling belt of population, to which Columbus at last affixed the clasp. The Atlantic face of the Americas formed therefore the drowsy unstirred orient of the inhabited world, which westward developed growing activity, dreaming a civilization in Mexico and Peru, roused to artistic and maritime achievement in Oceanica and the Malay archipelago, to permanent state-making and real cultural development in Asia, and attaining the highest civilization at last in Western Europe. There was the sunset margin of the inhabited world, the area of achievement, the adult Occident, facing across the dividing ocean that infant Orient beyond. Here the Old World, the full-grown world, had accumulated in Columbus' time the matured forces of a hemisphere. It was searching for some outlet across the shoreless distances of the Atlantic, waiting for some call from its voiceless beyond. The Atlantic Abyss in Historic Movements of Peoples. This deep, unbridged chasm of the Atlantic, closed only 400 years ago, must be taken into account in all investigations of the geographical distribution of races, whether in prehistoric or historic times. The influences of those ages when it formed an impassable gulf are still operative in directing the movements of the peoples today inhabiting its shores, because that barrier maintained the continents of America as a vast territorial reserve, sparsely inhabited by a Stone Age people, and affording a fresh field for the superior, accumulated energies of Europe. Races and continents. Australia and the double continent of America show each the coincidence of an ethnic realm with an isolated continent. In contrast, when we come to the Old World triad of Europe, Asia and Africa, we find three races, to be sure, but races whose geographical distribution ignores the boundaries of the continents. The white race belongs to all three, and from time immemorial has made the central basin of the Mediterranean the white man's sea. The Mongolian, though primarily at home in Asia, stretches along the coast of the Arctic Ocean to the Atlantic shores of Norway, and in historical times has penetrated up the Danube to the foot of the Alps. Nor was the Negroid stock confined to Africa, though Africa has always been its geographical core. The Indian Peninsula and Malay Archipelago, once peopled by a primitive Negroid race, but now harboring only remnants of them in the Deccan, Malacca, the Philippines and elsewhere, bridge the distance to the other great Negroid center in Melanesia and the derivative or secondary Negroid area of Australia. 768 The Negroid race belongs essentially to the long southern land pendants of the Eastern Hemisphere, and wherever it has bordered on the lighter northern stocks, it has drawn a typical boundary zone of mingled tints which never diverges far from the equator, from the Atlantic shores of the Sudan to Pacific Fiji. 769, see map page 105. The effort of the old ethnology, as represented by Blumenbach, to make a five-fold division of the races in agreement with the five continents was a mistake. To distinguish between the continents is one thing and to distinguish between the races is another. Neither biogeography nor anthropo-geography can adopt the continents as geographical provinces, although floras, faunas, and races the world over give evidence of partial or temporary restriction to a certain continent, whence they have overflowed to other lands. A ground plan for the geographical classification of races is to be found, as Tyler says, in the fact that they are not found scattered indiscriminately over the Earth's surface, but that certain races belong to certain regions, in whose peculiar environment they have developed their type, and whence they have spread to other lands, undergoing modifications from race intermixture and successive changes of environment on the way. 770. Contrast of the northern and southern continents. From this general law of race movements it follows that certain groups of landmasses, favored by location and large area, play a great imperial role, holding other lands as appanage. The Eastern Hemisphere, as we have seen, enjoys this advantage over the Western. Still more the Northern Hemisphere, blessed with an abundance of land and a predominant temperate zone location, is able to lord it over the Southern, so insular in its poverty of land. The history of the Northern Hemisphere is marked by far-reaching historical influences and wide control, that of the Southern, by detachment, aloofness and impotence, due to the small area and isolation of its landmasses. A subordinate role is its fate. Australia will always follow in the train of Eurasia, whence alone it has derived its incentives and means of progress. Neither the southern half of Africa nor South America has ever in historical times struck out a road to advancement unaided by its northern neighbors. Primitive South America developed the only independent civilization that ever blossomed in the southern hemisphere, but the Peruvian achievements in progress were inferior to those of Mexico and Central America. 771. Isolation of the southern continents. This subordination of the southern continents is partly due to the fact that they have only one side of contact or neighborhood with any other land, that is, on the north, yet even here the contact is not close. In Australia, the medium of communication is a long bridge of islands, in America, a winding island chain and a mountainous isthmus, in Africa, a broad zone of desert dividing the Mediterranean or Eurasian from the tropical and negroid part of the continent. Intercourse was not easy, and produced clear effects only in the case of Africa. Enlightenment filtering in here was sadly dimmed as it spread. Moreover, it was delayed till the introduction from Asia of the horse and camel, which were not native to Africa, and which, as Ratzel points out, alone made possible the long journey across the Sahara. The opposite or peninsular sides, running out as great spurs from the compacter landmasses of the north, look southward into vacant wastes of water, find no neighbors in those Antarctic seas. Owing to this unfavorable location on the edge of things, they were historically dead until 4 centuries ago, when oceanic navigation opened up the Great Sea Route of the Southern Hemisphere, and for the first time included them in the world's circle of communication. But even when lifted by the ensuing Europeanizing process, they only emphasized the fundamental dependence of the Southern Hemisphere upon the superior geographical endowments of the Northern. Effect of continental structure upon historical development. The build of the landmasses influences fundamentally the movements and hence the development of the races who inhabit them. A simple continental structure gives to those movements a few simple features and a wide monotonous distribution which checks differentiation. A manifold, complex build, varied in relief and ragged in contour, breaks up the moving streams of peoples, turns each branch into a different channel, lends it a distinctive character through isolation, finally brings it up in a cul-de-sac formed by a peninsula or mountain-rimmed basin, where further movement is checked and the process of local individualization begins. Therefore, great simplicity of continental build may result in historical poverty, as in the flat quadrangle of European Russia, the level plateau of Africa, and the smooth Atlantic slope of North America, with its neatly trimmed outline. Complexity, abounding in contrasted environments, tends to produce a varied wealth of historical development. Africa lies on the surface of the ocean, a huge torso of a continent, headless, memberless, inert. Here is no diversity of outward form, no contrast of zonal location, no fructifying variety of geographic conditions. Humanity has forgotten to grow in its stationary soil. Only where the Suez Isthmus formed an umbilical cord uniting ancient Egypt to the mother continent of Asia was Africa vitalized by the pulse of another life. European influences penetrated little beyond the northern coast. Asia, on the other hand, radiating great peninsulas, festooned with islands, supporting the vast corrugations of its highlands and lowlands, its snow-capped mountains and steaming valleys, stretching from the equator through all the zones to the ice-blocked shores of the Arctic, knowing drought and deluge, tundra waste and teeming jungle, has offered the manifold environment and segregated areas for individualized civilizations, which have produced such far-reaching historical results. The same fact is true of Europe, and that in an intensified degree. Here a complex development of mountains and highlands built on diverse axes, peninsulas which comprise 27% and islands which comprise nearly 8% of the total area, 772 vast thalassic inlets cleaving the continent to the core, have provided an abundance of those naturally defined regions which serve as cradles of civilization and, reacting upon the continent as a whole, endow it with lasting historical significance. 773 Even Strabo saw this. He begins his description of the inhabited world with Europe, because, as he says, it has such a polymorphous formation and is the region most favorable to the mental and social ennoblement of man. 774. Structure of North and South America. In North and South America, great simplicity of continental build gave rise to a corresponding simplicity of native ethnic and cultural condition. There is only one marked contrast throughout the length of this double continent, that between its Atlantic and Pacific slopes. On the Atlantic side of the Cordilleras, a vast trough extends through both landmasses from the Arctic Ocean to Patagonia, This has given to migration in each a longitudinal direction and therefore constantly tended to nullify the diversities arising from contrasted zonal conditions. On the Pacific side of North America, there has been an unmistakable migration southward along the accessible coast from Alaska to the Columbia River, and down the great intermontane valleys of the western highlands from the Great Basin to Honduras, 775, while South America shows the same meridional movement for 2,000 miles along the Pacific coast and longitudinal valleys of the Andes system. There was little encouragement to cut across the grain of the continents. The eastern range of the Cordilleras drew in general a dividing line between the eastern and western tribes. 776 Though Athapascans from the east overstepped it at a few points in North America, the Great Divide has served effectually to isolate the two groups from one another and to draw that line of linguistic cleavage which Major Powell has set down in his Map of Indian Linguistic Stocks. Consequently, Americanists recognize a distinct resemblance among the members of the North Atlantic group of Indians, as among those of the South Atlantic group, but they note an equally distinct contrast between each of them and its corresponding Pacific group. Nor is this contrast superficial, it extends to physical traits, temperament and culture. 777 and appears in the use of the vigesimal system of enumeration in primitive Mexico, Central America, among the Tlingits of the northwest coast and the Eskimo as also among the Chukchas and Ainus of Asia, while in the Atlantic section of North America the decimal system, with one doubtful exception, was alone in use. 778. Cultural superiority of the Pacific Slope Indians. To the anthropogeographer, the significant fact is that all the higher phases of native civilization are confined to the Pacific Slope group of Indians, which includes the Mexican and Isthmian tribes. From the elongated center of advanced culture stretching from the Bolivian highlands northward to the Anahuac Plateau, the same type shades off by easy transitions through northern Mexico and the Pueblo country, vanishes among the lower intrusive stocks of Oregon and California, only to reappear among the Haidas and Tlingits of British Columbia and Alaska, whose cultural achievements show affinity to those of the Mayas in Yucatan. 779 Dahl found certain distinguishing customs or characteristics spread north and south along the western slope of the continent in a natural geographical line of migration. They included librettifery, tattooing the chin of adult women, certain uses of masks, a certain style of conventionalizing natural objects, the use of conventional signs as hieroglyphics, a peculiar facility in carving wood and stone, a similarity of angular designs on their pottery and basketry, and of artistic representations connected with their common religious or mythological ideas. Many singular forms of carvings and the method of superimposing figures of animals one upon another in their totem poles are found from Alaska to Panama, except in California. These distinguishing features of an incipient culture are found nowhere else in North America, even sporadically. Dahl therefore concludes that they have been impressed upon the American aboriginal world from without, and on the ground of affinities, attributes their origin to Oceanica. 780. Cyrus Thomas, on the basis of the character and distribution of the archaeological remains in North America, concurs in this opinion. He finds that these remains fall into two classes, one east of the Rocky Mountain watershed and the other west. When those of the Pacific Slope as a whole are compared with those of the Atlantic Slope, there is a dissimilarity which marks them as the products of different races or as the result of different race influences. He emphasizes the resemblance of the customs, arts, and archaeological remains of the West Coast to those of the opposite shores and islands of the Pacific, and notes the lack of any resemblance to those of the Atlantic, and finally leans to the conclusion that the continent was peopled from two sources, one incoming stream distributing itself over the Atlantic slope, and the other over the Pacific, the two becoming gradually fused into a comparatively homogeneous race by long continental isolation. Yet these two sources may not necessarily include a transatlantic origin for one of the contributing streams. Ethnic evidence is against such a supposition, because the characteristics of the American race and of the archaeological remains point exclusively to affinity with the people of the Pacific. 781 John Edward Payne also reaches the same conclusion, though on other grounds. 782 Lack of segregated districts. The one strong segregating feature in primitive America was the Cordilleras, which held east and west apart. In the natural pockets formed by the high intermontane valleys of the Andes and the Anahuac Plateau, and in the constricted Isthmian region, the continent afforded a few secluded localities where civilization found favorable conditions of development. But in general, the paucity of large coast articulations, and the adverse polar or subpolar location of most of these, the situation of the large tropical islands along that barren Atlantic abyss, and the lack of a broken or varied relief, have prevented the Americas from developing numerous local centers of civilization, which might eventually have lifted the cultural status of the continents. 783. Coast articulations of continents. It is necessary to distinguish two general classes of continental articulations. First, marginal dependences, like the fringe of European peninsulas and islands, resulting from a deeply serrated contour, and second, surface subdivisions of the interior, resulting from differences of relief or defined often by enclosing mountains or deserts, like the Tibetan Plateau, the Basin of Bohemia, the Per-River Trough, or the sand-rimmed valley of the Nile. The first class is by far the more important, because of the intense historical activity which results from the vitalizing contact with the sea. But in considering coast articulations, anthropo-geography is led astray unless it discriminates between these on the basis of size and location. Without stopping to discuss the obvious results of a contrasted zonal location, such as that between Labrador and Yucatan, the Kola Peninsula and Spain, it is necessary to keep in mind always the effect of vicinal location. An outlying coastal dependency like Ireland has had its history impoverished by excessive isolation, in contrast to the richer development of England, Jutland, and Zealand in the same latitude, because these have profited from the closer neighborhood of other peripheral regions. So from ancient times, Greece has had a similar advantage over the Crimea, the Tunisian peninsula of North Africa over Spain, the Cotentin Peninsula of France over Brittany, and Kent over Cornwall or Caithness in Great Britain. Importance of size in continental articulations. Articulations on a vast scale, like the southern peninsulas of Asia, produce quite different cultural and historical effects from small physical subdivisions, like the fjord promontories and skerries of Norway and southern Alaska, or the finger peninsulas of the Peloponnesus. The significant difference lies in the degree of isolation which the two types yield. Large continental dependencies of the Asiatic class resemble small continents in their power to segregate, while overgrown capes like ancient Attica and Argolis or the more bulky Peloponnesus have their exclusiveness tempered by the mediating power of the small marine inlets between them. Small articulations, by making a coast accessible, tend to counteract the excessive isolation of a large articulation. They themselves develop in their people only minor or inner differentiations, which serve to enrich the life of the island or peninsula as a whole, but do not invade its essential unity. The contrast in the history of Hellas and the Peloponnesus was due largely to their separation from one another, yet neither was able to make of its people anything but Greeks. Wales and Cornwall show in English history the same contrast and the same underlying unity. Historical contrast of large and small peninsulas. In discussing continental articulations, therefore, it makes a great difference whether we draw our deductions from small projections of the coast, like Wales, the Peloponnesus, Brittany, and the Crimea, whose areas range from 7,442 to 10,023 square miles, 19,082 to 25,700 square kilometers, or the four Mediterranean peninsulas, which range in size from the 58,110 square miles, 149,000 square kilometers, of the Apennine Peninsula to the 197,600 square miles, 506-600 square kilometers, of Asia Minor and the 227,700 square miles, 584,000 square kilometers, of the Iberian, or the vast continental alcoves of southern Asia, like farther India with its 650,000 square miles, 1,667,000 square kilometers, hither India with 814,320 square miles, 2,088,000 square kilometers, and Arabia with 1,064,700 square miles, 2730-000 square kilometers, 0.784. The fact that the large compound peninsula of Western Europe, which comprises Spain, Portugal, France, Jutland, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, Italy, and Western Germany, and has its base in the stricture between the Adriatic and the Baltic, is about the size of peninsular India, suggests how profound may be the difference in geographic effects between large and small peripheral divisions. The three huge extremities which Asia thrusts forward into the Indian Ocean are geographical entities, which in point of size and individualization rank just below the continents, and in relation to the solid mass of Central Asia, they have exhibited in many respects an aloofness and self-sufficiency that have resulted in an historical divergence approximating that of the several continents. India, which has more productive territory than Australia and a population not much smaller than that of Europe, becomes to the administrators of its government the continent of India, as it is regularly termed in the statistical atlas published at Calcutta. Farther, India has in the long-drawn pendant of Malacca a sub-peninsula half as large again as Italy. The Deccan has in Ceylon an insular dependency the size of Tasmania. The whole scale is continental. It appears again somewhat diminished in the largest articulations of Europe, in Scandinavia, the British Isles, the Iberian and Balkan peninsulas. This continental scale stamps also the anthropo-geography of such large individualized fields. They are big enough for each to comprise one or even several nations, and isolated enough to keep their historical processes for long periods at a time to a certain extent detached from those of their respective continents. Peninsular conditions most favorable to historical development. The most favorable conditions for historical development obtain where the two classes of marginal articulation are combined, and where they occur in groups, as we find them in the Mediterranean and the North Sea Baltic basin. Here the smaller indentations multiply contact with the sea, and provide the harbors, bays and breakwaters of capes and promontories which make the coast accessible. The larger articulations, by their close grouping, break up the sea into the minor thalassic basins which encourage navigation, and thus ensure the exchange of their respective cultural achievements. In other words, such conditions present the preeminent advantages of vicinal location around an enclosed sea. The enormous articulations of southern Asia suffer from their paucity of small indentations, all the more because of their vast size and subtropical location. The Grecian type of peninsula, with its broken shoreline, finds here its large-scale homologue only in farther India, to which the Sunda Islands have played in history the part of a gigantic Cyclades. The European type of articulation is found only about the Yellow Japan Sea, where the island of Hondo and the peninsulas of Shantung and Korea reproduce approximately the proportions of Great Britain, Jutland, and Italy respectively. Arabia and India, like the angular shoulder of Africa which protrudes into the Indian Ocean, measure an imposing length of coastline, but this length shrinks in comparison with the vast area of the peninsulas. The contour of a peninsula is like the surface of the brain, in both it is convolutions that count. Southern Asia has had lobes enough but too few convolutions. For this reason, the northern Indian Ocean, despite its exceptional location as the eastward extension of the Mediterranean route to the Orient, found its development constantly arrested till the advent of European navigators. Length of coastline. Although the peripheral articulations of a continent differ anthropogeographically according to their size, their zonal and vicinal location, yet large and small, Arctic and tropical, are grouped indiscriminately together in the figures that state the length of coastlines. For this reason, statistics of continental coastlines have little value. For instance, the fact that Eurasia has 67,000 miles, 108,000 kilometers, and North America 46,500 miles, 75,000 kilometers, of contact with the ocean is not illuminating. These figures do not reveal the fact that the former has its greatest coastal length on its tropical and subtropical side, while the latter continent has wasted inlets and islands innumerable in the long, bleak stretch from Newfoundland poleward around to Bering Sea. The continental base of the peninsulas. Peninsulas are accessible from the sea according to the configuration of their coasts, but from their hinterland, according to the length and nature of their connection with the same. This determines the degree of their isolation from the landmass. If they hang from the continent by a freight string, as does the Peloponnesus, Crimea, Malacca, Indian Gujarat, and Nova Scotia, they are segregated from the life of the mainland almost as completely as if they were islands. The same effects follow where the base of a peninsula is defined by a high mountain barrier, as in all the Mediterranean peninsulas, in the two Indias, and in Korea, or by a desert like that which scantily links Arabia to Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, or by a blur of swamps and lakes such as half detaches Scandinavia, Courland, Estland, and Finland from Russia. Held to their continents by bonds that often fail to bind, subjected by their outward-facing peripheral location to every centrifugal force, feeling only slightly the pull of the great central mass behind, peninsulas are often further detached economically and historically by their own contrasted local conditions. A sharp transition in geological formation and therefore in soil, a difference of climate, rainfall, drainage system, of flora or fauna, serve greatly to emphasize the lack of community of interests with the continental interior, and therefore produce an inevitable diversity of historical development. 785 Hence, many peninsulas insulate their people as completely as islands. It is hard to say whether the Pyrenean Peninsula or Sicily, Scandinavia or Great Britain, has held itself more aloof from the political history of remaining Europe, whether Korea is not more entitled to its name of the Hermit Kingdom than island Japan could ever be, whether the Peloponnesus or Euboea was more intimately associated with the radiant life of ancient Hellas. These questions lead to another, namely, whether a high mountain wall like the Pyrenees, or a narrow strait like that of Messina is the more effective geographical boundary. Continental base, a zone of transition. Peninsulas not infrequently gain in breadth as they approach the continent. Here they tend to abate their distinctive character as lobes of the mainland, together with the ethnic and historical marks of isolation. Here they form a doubtful boundary zone of mingled continental and peninsular development. Such peninsulas fall naturally, therefore, into a continental and a peninsular section, and reveal this segmentation in the differentiated history of the two portions. That great military geographer Napoleon distinguished the Italy of the Po basin as Italy continentale, and the Apennine section as Presqu'île. Not only is the former broader, but, expanding like a tree trunk near the ground, it sends its roots well back into the massive interior of the continent. It is dominated more by the Alps than by the Apennines. It contains a lowland and a river of continental proportions, for which there is no space on the long, narrow spur of southern Italy. If its geographical character approximates that of the mainland, so does its ethnic and historical. The Po basin is a well-defined area of race characterization, in which influences have made for intermixture. South of the crest of the Apennines, the Italian language in its purity begins, in contrast to the Gallo-Italian of the north. This mountain ridge has also held apart the dark, short dolichocephalic stock of the Mediterranean race from the fairer, taller, broad-headed Celts, who have moved down into the Po basin from the Alps, and the Germans and Illyrians who have entered it from the northeast. 786 Northern Italy is therefore allied ethnically, as it has often been united politically, to the neighboring countries abutting upon the Alps, so that it has experienced only in a partial degree that detachment which has stamped the history of the Apennine section. Historical contrast between base and extremity. The Balkan Peninsula tells much the same story of contrasted geographic conditions and development in its continental and peninsular sections. Greece proper, in ancient as in modern times, reached its northern confines where the peninsula suddenly widens its base through Macedonia and Thrace. In this narrow southern section today, especially in isolated Peloponnesus, Attica, and the high-walled garden of Thessaly, are found people of the pure, long-headed, Hellenic type, and here the Greek language prevails. 787 But that broad and alien north, long excluded from the Amphictyonic Council and a stranger to Aegean culture in classical times, is occupied today by a congeries of Slavs, who form a southwestern spur of the Slav stock covering Eastern Europe. Its political history shows how often it has been made a Danubian or continental state, by Alexander of Macedon, by the Romans, Bulgarians, and Ottoman Turks 788 as it may be someday by Russia, and also how often its large and compact form has enabled it to dominate the tapering peninsular section to the south. In the same way, the vast Ganges and Indus basins, which constitute the continental portion of India, have received various Tibetan, Scythian, Aryan, Pathan, and Mongol Tartar ingredients from Central Asia, and by reason of the dense populations supported by these fruitful river plains, it has been able to dominate politically, religiously, and culturally the protruding triangle of the Deccan. See maps pages 8 and 102. The continental side of Arabia, the Mesopotamian valley which ties the peninsula to the highlands of Persia and Armenia, has received into its Semitic stock constant infiltrations of Turanian and Aryan peoples from the core of Asia. This process has been going on from the ancient Elamite and Persian conquests of Mesopotamia down to the Ottoman invasion and the present periodic visits of Kurdish shepherds to the pastures of the Upper Tigris. 789 Here we have the same contrast of geographic conditions as in Italy and India, a wide, populous alluvial plain occupying the continental section of the peninsula, and a less attractive highland or mountainous region in the outlying spur of land. Continental base a scene of invasion and war. These continental sections of peninsulas become therefore strongly marked as areas of ethnic characterization and differentiated historical development. Their threshold location, by reason of which they first catch any outward migration from the core of the continent, and their fertility, which serves as a perennial lure to newcomers, whether peaceful or warlike, combine to give them intense historical activity. They catch the come and go between their wide hinterland and the projection of land beyond, the stimulus of new arrivals and fresh blood. But tragedy too is theirs. The Po Valley has been called the cockpit of Europe. Even the Little Eider, which marks the base of Jutland, has been the scene of war between Danes and Germans since the 10th century. 790 The Indus Valley has again and again felt the shock of conflict with invading hordes from the Central Highlands, and witnessed the establishment of a succession of empires. Peace at the gates of the Balkan Peninsula has never been of long duration, and the postern door of Korea has been stormed often enough. Peninsular extremities as areas of isolation. In contrast to these continental sections which stand in contact with the solid landmass behind, the extremities of the peninsulas are areas of isolation and therefore generally of ethnic unity. They often represent the last stand of displaced people pressed outward into these narrow quarters by expanding races in their rear. The vast triangle of the Deccan, which forms the essentially peninsular part of India, is occupied, except in the more exposed northwest corner, by the Dravidian race which once occupied all India, and afterward was pushed southward by the influx of more energetic peoples. 791 Here they have preserved their speech and nationality unmixed and live in almost primitive simplicity. 792 In the peninsular parts of Great Britain, in northern Scotland, Wales and Cornwall, we find people of Celtic speech brought to bay on these remote spurs of the land, affiliating little with the varied folk which occupied the continental side of the island, and resisting conquest to the last. 793 The mountainous peninsula of Western Connaught in Ireland has been the rocky nucleus of the largest Celtic-speaking community in the island. 794 Brittany, with a similar location, became the last refuge of Celtic speech on the mainland of Europe. 795 The seat of resistance to Norman and later to English conquest, finally the stronghold of conservatism in the French Revolution. Ethnic unity of peninsulas. The northern wall of the Apennines and the outpost barrier of the Alps have combined to protect peninsular Italy from extensive ethnic infusions from the direction of the continent. This portion of the country shows therefore, as the anthropological maps attest, a striking uniformity of race. It has been a melting pot in which foreign elements, filtering through the breaches of the Apennines or along the southern coast, have been fused into the general population under the isolating and cohesive influences of a peninsular environment. 796 The population of the Iberian Peninsula is even more unified, probably the most homogeneous in Europe. Here the long-headed Mediterranean race is found in the same purity as in island Corsica and Sardinia. 797 Spain's short line of contact with France and its sharp separation by the unbroken wall of the Pyrenees robs the peninsula of any distinctly continental section, and consequently of any transitional area of race and culture. Hence the unity of Spain as opposed to that twofold balanced diversity which we find in Italy and India. The Balkan Peninsula, on the other hand, owing to the great predominance of its continental section and the confused relief of the country, has not protected its distinctively peninsular or Greek section from the southward migrations of Slavs, Albanians, Wallachians, and other continental peoples. 798 It has been like a big funnel with a small mouth. The pressure from above has been very great. Hellas and even the Peloponnesus have had their peninsularity impaired and their race mixed, owing to the predominant continental section to the north. Peninsulas as intermediaries. Peninsulas, so far as they project from their continents, are areas of isolation, but so far as they extend also toward some land beyond, they become intermediaries. The isolating and intermediary aspects can be traced in the anthropo-geographical effects of every peninsula, even those which, like Brittany and Cornwall, project into the long uncharted waste of the Atlantic. In the order of historical development, a peninsula first isolates, until in its secluded environment it has molded a mature, independent people. Then, as that people outgrows its narrow territory, the peninsula becomes a favorable base for maritime expansion to distant lands, or becomes a natural avenue for numerous reciprocal relations with neighboring lands beyond. Korea was the bridge for Mongolian migration from continental Asia to the Japan Islands, and for the passage thither of Chinese culture, whether intellectual, aesthetic, industrial or religious. 799 It has been the one country conspicuous in the foreign history of Japan. Conquered by the Island Empire in 1592, it paid tribute for nearly 3 centuries and yielded to its foreign master the southeastern port of Fusan, the Calais of Korea. 800 Since the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905 made it subject to Japan, it has become the avenue of Japanese expansion to the mainland and the unwilling recipient of the modern civilization thrust upon it by these English of the East. In like manner, the Pyrenean Peninsula has always been the intermediary between Europe and Northwest Africa. Its population, as well as its flora and fauna, group with those of the southern continent. It has served as transit land between north and south for the Carthaginians, Vandals, and Saracens, and in modern times it has maintained its character as a link by the Portuguese occupation of the Tangiers Peninsula in the 15th century, 801, and the Spanish possession of Ceuta and various other points along the Moroccan coast from the year 709 AD to the present. 802. Peninsulas of intercontinental location. This role of intermediary is inevitably thrust upon all peninsulas which, like Spain, Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, Arabia, farther India, Malacca, Chukchi and Siberia, and Alaska, occupy an intercontinental location. Arabia, especially in its climate, flora, races and history, shows the haul and pull now of Asia, now of Africa. From it Asiatic influences have spread over Africa to Morocco and the Niger River on the west, and to Zanzibar on the south, permeated Abyssinia, and penetrated to the great equatorial lakes, whether in the form of that Mecca-born worship of Allah, or the creeping caravans and slave gangs of Arab trader. Of all such intercontinental peninsulas, Florida alone seems to have had no role as an intermediary. Its native ethnic affinities were wholly with its own continent. It has given nothing to South America and received nothing thence. The northward expansion of Arawak and Carib tribes from Venezuela in historic times ceased at Cuba and Haiti. The straits drew a dividing line. Local conditions in Florida itself probably furnish the explanation of this anomaly. Extensive swamps made the central and southern portion of the peninsula inhospitable to colonization from either direction, transformed it from a link into a barrier. Atlantic peninsulas of Europe. Peninsulas which conspicuously lack an intercontinental location must long await their intermediary phase of development, but do not escape it. The Cornish, Breton and Iberian peninsulas were all prominent in the transatlantic enterprises of Europe from the end of the 15th century. The first French sailors to reach the New World were Breton and Norman fishermen. Plymouth, as the chief port of the Cornish peninsula, figures prominently in the history of English exploration and settlement in America. It seems scarcely accidental that most of Queen Elizabeth's great sea captains were natives of this district: Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and Sir Walter Raleigh, the latter holding the office of Vice-Admiral of Cornwall and Devon. It was the peninsula-like projection of South America about Cape St. Roque, 20 degrees farther east than Labrador, that welcomed the ships of Cabral and Americus Vespucius, and secured to Portugal a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Notes to Chapter 12. 747, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 1, page 336. London, 1896–1898. 748, D. G. Brinton, The American Race, page 41. Philadelphia, 1901. 749, D. G. Brinton, Races and Peoples, pages 239–240. Philadelphia, 1901. Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 1, page 336. London, 1896–1898. 750, A. E. Wallace, Island Life, page 14. New York, 1892. 751, A. Heilprin, Geographical Distribution of Animals, page 69, map. 1887, 752. Ibid, pages 78, 82, 90, 100. 753, Darwin, Origin of Species, Chapter 12. New York, 1895. A. R. Wallace, Island Life, page 6. New York, 1892. 754, W. Z. Ripley, Races of Europe, map on page 43. New York, 1899. 755, Ibid, pages 39, 50, 80. Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 2, pages 100–110. London, 1896–1898. 756, H. Keane, Ethnology, pages 231–232, 362. Cambridge, 1896. 757, McGee and Thomas, Prehistoric North America, page 56, Volume 19 of History of North America. Philadelphia, 1905, 757, 758. Fisk, Discovery of America, Volume 1, page 224. Boston, 1893. 759, for various Asiatic and Oceanic elements, see Franz Boas, The Indians of British Columbia, Bull. Of the America Geography, Society Volume 28, page 229. The Northwest Coast Tribes, Science, Volume 12, pages 194–196. Niblack, The Indians of the Northwest Coast, page 385, Washington. H. H. Bancroft, The Native Races, Volume 1, pages 177, 178, footnote, pages 210, 225. San Francisco, 1886. W. Z. Ripley, Races of Europe, map page 42. New York, 1899. 760, T. W. Higginson and William MacDonald, History of the United States, page 21. New York and London, 1905. 761, Edward John Payne, History of the New World Called America, Volume 2, pages 64–68, 74–77, 305, 388–389. Oxford, 1899. 762, Justin Windsor, Narrative and Critical History, Volume 1, page 60. Boston, 1889. 763, cited by E. J. Payne, History of the New World Called America, Volume 2, page 292, footnote page 294. Oxford, 1899. 764, Waldemar Jochelson, The Mythology of the Koryak, The American Anthropologist, Volume 6, pages 415–416, 421 to 425. 1904, 765. W. D. Dahl, Masks, Labrets, and Certain Aboriginal Customs, 3rd Annual Report of Bureau of Ethnology, pages 46 to 147. Washington, 1884. 766, O. T. Mason, Migration and the Food Quest, pages 275 to 292. Washington, 1894. 767, McGee and Thomas, Prehistoric North America, pages 51, 58 to 82. Philadelphia, 1905. Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 1, pages 5 to 7, 145 to 147, 153 to 154. London, 1896 to 1898. 768, Ripley, Races of Europe, map page 42, pages 43 to 44. New York, 1899. 769, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 1, page 7. London, 1896 to 1898. 770, Tyler, Anthropology, pages 86 to 87. New York, 1881. 771, E. J. Payne, History of the New World Called America, Volume 2, pages 554 to 555. Oxford, 1899. 772, Justice Purdas, Taschen Atlas, page 17. Gotha, 1905. 773, Carl Ritter, Comparative Geography, pages 188 to 212. Translated by W. L. Gage, Philadelphia, 1865. N. S. Shaler, Nature and Man in America, pages 11 to 18, 151 to 165. New York, 1896. 774, Strabo, Book 2, Chapter 5, 26. 775, McGee and Thomas, Prehistoric North America, page 3, map. Philadelphia, 1905. 776, D. G. Brinton, Races and Peoples, pages 248 to 249. Philadelphia, 1901. 777, D. G. Brinton, The American Race, pages 58, 103 to 104. Philadelphia, 1901. McGee and Thomas, Prehistoric North America, page 86. Philadelphia, 1905. Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 1, pages 5 to 7, 145 to 147, 153. 778, Ibid, page 293. E. J. Payne, History of the New World Called America, Volume 2, page 315. Oxford, 1899. 779, Ibid, Volume 2, pages 412 to 417. McGee and Thomas, Prehistoric North America, pages 72 to 75. Philadelphia, 1905. 780, W. H. Dahl, Masks, Labrets, and Certain Aboriginal Customs, 3rd Annual Report of Bureau of Ethnology, pages 146 to 147. Washington, 1884. 781, Cyrus Thomas, Report of Mount Explorations, pages 522 to 523, 722 to 728. 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology, Washington, 1894. 782, E. J. Payne, History of the New World Called America, Volume 2, pages 382 to 383. Oxford, 1899. 783, N. S. Shaler, Nature and Man in America, pages 151, 168 to 173. New York, 1891. 784, Justice Purdas, Taschen Atlas, page 9. Gotha, 1905. 785, Carl Ritter, Comparative Geography, pages 191 to 192. Translated by W. L. Gage, Philadelphia, 1865. 786, W. Z. Ripley, Races of Europe, pages 247 to 258. New York, 1899. 787, Ibid, pages 403 to 409. 788, E. A. Freeman, Historical Geography of Europe, Atlas, Maps, 34, 49. London, 1882. 789, For Race Elements in Mesopotamia, see D. G. Hogarth, The Nearer East, Maps, pages 173 and 176. London, 1903. 790, E. A. Freeman, Historical Geography of Europe, pages 201 to 202, 506 to 508, 535 to 536, 541. London, 1882. 791, Imperial Gazetteer of India, Volume 1, pages 293 to 297. Oxford, 1907. 792, Sir Thomas Holdick, India, Ethnographical Map, page 201, pages 202, 213 to 216. London, 1905. B. H. Baden-Powell, The Indian Village Community, pages 111, 116, 119, 161. London, 1896. 793, W. Z. Ripley, Races of Europe, pages 312 to 321. New York, 1899. E. Reckless, Europe, Volume 4, pages 73, 83 to 84. New York, 1882. 794, H. J. Mackinder, Britain and the British Seas, Ethnographic Map, page 184, and page 306. London, 1904. 795, W. Z. Ripley, Races of Europe, pages 22, 23, 150 to 151. New York, 1899. 796, Ibid, pages 248, 258, 272. 797, Ibid, pages 247, 273. 798, Ibid, pages 403 to 409, and map. 799, F. Brinkley, Japan, Volume 1, pages 38 to 42, 70, 75 to 80, 83 to 84, 126. Boston and Tokyo, 1901. W. E. Griffiths, The Mikado's Empire, Volume 1, pages 73, 83. New York, 1903. 800, Henry Dyer, Die Nippon, pages 59, 69. New York, 1904. 801, E. A. Freeman, Historical Geography of Europe, page 558. London, 1882. 802, Ibid, pages 559, 561. Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, page 248. New York, 1858.